Patriarcado do Salário, Notas sobre Marx, Gênero e Feminismo, e, recentemente, o seu livro Reencantando o Mundo foi traduzido e lançado pela editora Elefante. A palestra dela vai ser sobre feminismo, reprodução social e em um mundo não capitalista. Então, vou passar a palavra para Silvia Federici. É um prazer, é uma honra enorme.
Good evening to you all, and thank you so much to Susan Castro and to the National Association, Philosophy Association, for inviting me to this event. I was, as Susan mentioned, I was a philosophy student as well, and the image of the owl of Minerva that I see on my screen reminds me that before the end of the night, we should also talk about the contribution the feminists have made to philosophy. I would argue that feminism has really restructured philosophy in recent time. Tonight, however, my main focus is on the contribution the feminist movement, in particular popular feminist movement, not the kind of institutional United Nations generated feminism that has been dominant in the media, but feminist popular movement, the contribution they have given, are giving to the construction of a non-capitalist society, an anti-capitalist struggle. And the argument that I'm going to make is that besides fighting, denouncing, protesting against social hierarchies, gender-based hierarchies to begin with, but all social hierarchies, feminist movements have given important contribution in three other ways. First, the fact that they have been fighting against the devaluation of the activities that are most important for the reproduction of our life. And a devaluation which is really a devaluation of our lives, which is really at the core of capitalist society and the capitalist organization of work. Secondly, feminist movements have demonstrated a particular and unique interest and commitment to the defense of social and natural wealth. And we see the reason for it. And third, today in particular, feminist movements are engaged in a broad process, of reconstruction of social reproduction, and in particular construction of more cooperative, more collaborative forms of reproductive work in a way that begins to overcome the fragmentation, separation, isolation in which women have been forced to engage in reproductive work throughout the history of capitalism. So these are the arguments that I'm going to make. But first of all, I want to say that feminist movements have revolutionized since the 1970s, from at least the 1970s, political theory and political struggle. Until the 70s, in much of the world, and definitely certainly we should not generalize too much, and we should definitely not universalize our statement. But to a great extent, the concept of social transformation, the concept of social revolution, and what constituted an anti-capitalist perspective was very much tied to the idea of socialism, Marxism, and to struggle that took the terrain of wage work, wage labor, the organization of production as their central focus. Many feminists did not necessarily separate from Marx and from the broader perspective, the horizon of the socialist movement. But what they introduced, which, as I said, was a major revolutionary development, was to establish, in theory and in practice, that the terrain of reproduction is a terrain that is structured by power relations, and it's a major terrain of struggle. In other words, they have broadened the concept of what is an anti-capitalist struggle. They've broadened, first of all, the concept of what are the forms of capitalist accumulation. What is the extent of capitalist relation in our life? And they have done so by an analysis and a rethinking of the roots of gender oppression, the roots of women's oppression, and discovering that this oppression really was founded on an organization of reproductive work that confined women to this work and at the same time totally devalued it. And secondly, that far from being a naturalized kind of activity, women's labor, something pertaining to the personality of women, reproductive work, or more commonly, housework, domestic work, it's actually a form of capitalist production. It's actually a form of capitalist production because this work we discovered is not work that simply provides services, personal services to our families, but is work also that daily and generationally produces and reproduces the workforce for capitalism, the workforce for every activity that is organized in a capitalist way. So that housework, domestic work, right? And we started calling it reproductive work precisely for this reason. We started calling it reproductive work precisely to stress the fact that this is work to stress what is the function of this work, that it reproduces not only our life, but reproducing as well labor power, people's capacities of work, people's capacity to present themselves every day at the workplace, and of course being exploited, being consumed, so that their labor needs to be reproduced again and again and again on a daily basis, and of course generational, right? So this was a major transformation because, for instance, it meant, first of all, that women's struggle were not struggle that would only be limited to supporting what men would be doing, but they were struggle that would directly have an effect on the capitalist organization of work. And because starting from that vision, we began to rethink, so many aspects of the capitalist organization of society. We began to see, for instance, that the family, the home, the community, it's a kind of factory, but a factory for the production of human beings, a factory for the production of workers. We began to see that the so-called housewives, working class women whose housework would be full-time work, that is so-called housewife, their life would be structured by the same temporal, the temporal forms of organization, and by the same needs and constraints that actually shape the lives of the husband, right? We began to see also, how capitalism has been able to perpetuate its role. The fact, for instance, that capitalism has been able to delegate to wage worker, the wage husband, to delegate to the wage worker through the instrument of the wage, the power to supervise, right, the work of the wife, the power to enforce, that work, and punish the woman in case she not comply with it. So we began to realize that domestic violence is really part of the organization of housework. It's really an essential part of the organization of housework. And that this is why, for a long time, it has been tolerated by government. It has never been considered a crime. In the same way as beating of children, punishing of children, even physically, emotionally, has never been considered a crime because it has been seen as part of the preparation of these children to become the future worker and to adapt to the future discipline of work, right? So in this sense, for example, in one of my books, I've spoken of the patriarchy of the wage, right? The patriarchal power, so much of patriarchal power in capitalism is maintained, is perpetuated, certainly through violence, physical and emotional, but also through the power of the wage. And then we began to see, of course, that the continuity, between the hierarchy built on gender and the continuity with the hierarchy, built on race or built on age, right? In other words, we began to see that contrary to what some of us had learned from Marx and the socialist movement, right? The basis, foundation, the core of capitalist accumulation of wealth has not been the work of the wage, but has been the work of a universe, a world of unwaged workers, the slaves, those working under colonial conditions, the unpaid laborers, in the home, unpaid students, etc., right? So that it's really the unpaid labor, not only the unpaid labor, which is part of the working day of the wage worker, but the unpaid labor of a whole population of people who, for example, the socialist movement did not see as central, right, to the struggle, central to the organization of production. So this is certainly has been a very, revolutionary, development that unfortunately did not produce, the kind of practical results that we would have hoped to see. Because to a great extent, much of the feminist struggle became concentrated on the struggle to, quote, escape the home and gain access, to wage work and gain access to jobs, forms of employment that traditionally have been male dominated. And of course, this was very much incentivized, by the intervention of the United Nations into feminist politics at the moment of great struggle of great crisis for capitalism. At the moment in which across the world, you had an anti-capitalist struggle mounting in the factories and the anti-colonial struggle the 60s were a great period of crisis of capitalism, and it is not an accident that by the 70s, the leadership, international capital, saw the need to open massively the doors of wage work to women, so that on the cheap labor of women, a whole restructuring of the global economy, was built, right? But of course, this does not diminish the importance of the contribution that the feminist movement gave to redefine what is work, redefine what is exploitation, what are the central territory, the central terrains, of the exploitation of workers and capitalist accumulation, and therefore really change the map of the anti-capitalist struggle in the same ways, and not accidentally, in the same ways as the anti-colonial movement had already done all through the 50s, actually all through, the 20th century, because the anti-colonial struggle really runs through all the 20th century. And in fact, there's no question that, this revolution in feminism was powerfully influenced, by the anti-colonial struggle, the struggle for civil rights and against segregation in the United States, so that connection is a connection that is extremely, extremely important and remains crucial, because we can really build a new world unless we erase, and that's essential to an anti-capitalist struggle, erase all forms of oppression and all forms of discrimination. The second point I wanted to make is also that what popular feminist movement are showing is that women have a particular, and I use the word women in a broad sense, have a unique and particular interest, in the defense of social wealth and natural wealth. And Vandana Shiva, put it very powerfully. She pointed out that because in the history of capitalism, women have had a much more difficult relation to the world of money, to the world of wage employment. Across the world, they have been generally much more dependent, on nature, on the natural produce in order to survive. And she has given, for example, in a famous book of her, Staying Alive, she has described what the forest, meant in the past, to women in India, how the forest was truly a true full reproductive system, because from it you could grow, fruits, you could grow medicinal herbs, and a whole set of products extremely necessary, for our reproduction, including rest, silence, spirituality, contact, sense of harmony, with our place in the world. And so this unique interest is also emphasized, by women's role in the process of social reproduction. The fact that women have been the main primary subject of reproductive work has meant and keeps in meaning that they are excruciatingly aware, of what are the consequences of the destruction of our natural habitat. And, in Brazil, I'm speaking and I'm sure and I'm saying what is well known, that women know that the destruction of the forest in the Amazonia, for instance, is the end of the community. There were a mining company or a petroleum drilling company comes to a community, it's really the end, because the poisoning of the crops, the poisoning of the soil, the poisoning of the waters on which people's subsistence, relies, it really means that very soon, very, very soon, the youth will have to leave the territory. That even though maybe some of the men immediately might be attracted by the wages, may be attracted by the wages that these companies are bringing. And we know that often women in this community have been at odds and in conflict with the men of their own communities, as well as with the guards of the companies that come. Because the men have the illusion, often after a long period of unemployment, they have the illusion that this money is wealth, right? But the women know that in the long term, this is the death of the community. And that's why, in very recent years, women have been truly in the front line. Women have been in the front line of the struggle for the defense of the forest, against contamination, against mining company, and so forth. And this not only in Africa or in Latin America, but we have seen it also, for example, in the United States. I don't know if you have known, in Brazil in 2016, for example, the great encampment the Lakota Sioux women built to protest against the building of a pipeline which would have contaminated the water of the Colorado River, on which their subsistence depended. And they built with an incredible organizational effort an encampment, that for 7 months, basically was able to resist and struggle and stop, the working of the companies, despite the incredible cold and despite constant brutal attack by the police. And this, of course, is something that has been happening in so many different situations, that the attack on the wealth of nature has come constantly and increasingly with an attack, a violence against women, right? We all know about the death and assassination of Berta Cáceres, but in reality, there are many Berta Cáceres, and Marielle Franco, of course, many Berta Cáceres and Marielle Francos who are being killed every day in Colombia, in Ecuador. And why? Because women have been really on the foreground, have been very much in the foreground of the struggle to maintain the wealth of their community and also to fight against all forms of oppression. And third, I want to speak, and when I speak of, these different forms, these different contributions that women are giving to an anti-capitalist struggle, I do not want to suggest that they are separate, but they are happening simultaneously. We have to imagine and see them simultaneously. But there are different elements that I think is important to emphasize. That together with the struggle for the defense of the natural environment, the defense of forests, again, I want to quote Vandana Shiva. She was one of the first already, in the late 70s, to bring attention to us, to the movement that she made famous, the Cheekbone Movement, which was a movement of women in India who could massively go, when the loggers who come in to cut the trees, they would come and hug the trees. They were 3 huggers, to put their body around them, to prevent them to cut the forests, right? And many more other examples like that could be made, you know, and you know, the women who in Kenya, for instance, you know, have planted hundreds of thousands of trees. But together with this defense of the environment, what we have also seen in a more recent year has been a very powerful move to create new forms of reproduction. And here again, you know, the center of these efforts, you know, have been, you know, those areas of the world like Africa, Latin America, you know, that have been especially under attack, you know, by the extension of capitalist relation that is involved in the globalization process. Globalization is really the globalization of capitalism. It's the extension to areas of the world and to parts of our life, including parts of our body, that had not been yet completely subjective to the logic of capital. And I will say the globalization has really been a process of recolonization, right? It's been really a process that is restored by financial means, as well as military means, but certainly by financial means through, you know, the imposition, the debt crisis artificially created, through the imposition of structural adjustment, you know, through the imposition of deadly conditionalities that have basically restored the same situation, the same condition of existence that were prevailing in the colonial world, right? And so in these very countries, you know, where there has been and continues to be a war, you know, on communities, a war on the communities' forms of subsistence, and entire population are constantly being displaced, for example, from rural areas, forced to abandon their ancestral land. What we have also been seeing is that the same population, and particularly women among them, have forced to urbanize, have also begun to recreate new communities, and new communities built not only on collective labor, but even more specifically on collective forms of reproduction, right? So that out of the crisis, you know, and this is something that is important to learn from, and reflect upon, because it is very close. What it has shown is that in moment of crisis, in those moments where life is in the balance, life and social defeat are in the balance, right? They need to unite. They need to join forces. They need to create collective forms of action and reproduction, right? Is paramount, is what makes the difference between, in a sense, life and death. Total submission, or the capacity to maintain a degree of autonomy, a degree of self-sufficiency, the capacity to not be completely subordinated and crushed, you know, by the logic of the market. And so what we have seen in this moment of crisis, from Chile to Argentina, to Brazil, to Mexico, has been a community of women who have come together in what in Argentina called, you know, the Villa Miseria, these encampments literally produced over years, you know, by collective work in which women have been at the center, right? With, again, new forms of reproduction, the collective kitchen, for instance. This is something that is becoming more widespread. The collective kitchen, where you find many women working together with also youth, young men, not every day. Each day, a different group of women, and they're producing for the community. They are actually cooking and producing. The urban garden, Urban farming, for example, in response to the expulsion of many populations from urban area, urban farming has been growing in many parts of the world, to the point that some observers have commented that we are beginning to see a breakdown of what in capitalism has been the historic separation between country and city, right? So that African women, in many capitals, that used to begin their cooking by planting something in the ground, by planting something in their garden, and whose household began in the garden, began in the fields, in the campo. See those women forced to move to the cities or to urban area, appropriating any piece of land that they could get, and begin to farm it, and also in the way begin to make connection with urban movements. So this is a very important development, because clearly, again, it's not a kind of activity that can be necessarily universalized, but certainly it indicates, how in moments of crisis, and we are living in moments of crisis, right? We are also forced to invent new forms of communalism, new communitarian relations. And we are discovering that the construction of those communitarian relations are actually giving us the possibility of much more resistance with regard to capitalism, giving us the possibility, to confront, negotiate, because clearly we are in a world in which we are still surrounded by capitalist relations, right? But we can be isolated, fragmented, separated, and in this way, much more defeated. And as women, we know what isolation in the home, what the nuclearization of reproduction, what the isolation, right, of domestic life, what has been the cost of it, how difficult it has been, to in fact engage in a social struggle. And so these new forms of more cooperative, more collaborative forms of reproduction, right, are really enlightening, because they're showing us that they give, in fact, they create communities of resistance. They increase, the power to resist the state. And I have been, in fact, also very interested in I'm now very, very interested in understanding, how the change, the breakdown, of traditional institutional form, and the building of more communal form can be extended to also other areas of communal life, of our daily life. And for example, how the question of communitarian relation can, for example, be extended, as it has been traditionally in indigenous communities, right, to the field of justice, which is now dominated by a very punitive logic. I'm sure you are aware that in the United States, particularly after a whole series of assassinations of young Black men, beginning with George Floyd and others, there has been a powerful abolitionist movement has grown. A movement that demands the abolition, fights for the abolition of the carceral conception of life, The castle, the idea that, we have to incarcerate people, and the abolition also of the police, because the police is seen as an occupational force. In the United States, this is very clear because the police has been really a product, of the enforcement of slavery. So it's a police that is really, in its modalities, in its forms of organization, in its conception, it's really built, in the enforcement of slavery. And so particularly coming from the Black community, the word of abolition is now very important. And that means that we have to rethink also the forms of justice. We have to rethink. And here the experience of indigenous community, I often say these days that particularly in the feminist movement, there's been the feminist movement, the politics of the feminist movement have gone through a process of indigenization, right? Indigenization because there's been an influence, of certainly inspired by the example of the Zapatistas, that has been very powerful, inspired also, by the increasing amount of contact with indigenous people who have literally been forced out of the ancestral land and then joined movement in the urban centers, that have also communicated, and shared, their culture, their cosmovision, their conception of communal relations. So the question of building more communitarian forms of life, I think is something that today, makes the feminist movement, particularly in Latin America, parts of Africa, really extremely important in an anti-capitalist struggle. Both because they are strengthening our capacity for resistance, but also because if we want to build a society beyond capitalism, a society that is not organized around the logic of the exploitation of labor, the logic of profit, we need to go through a long process of experimentation. A long process of experimentation. The building of the new society is not going to be to some sort of cataclysmic revolution where everything will be changed. Will be go through a process, the very process of struggle, in which we learn. We learn to what it needs. We learn how to overcome the division between us, those divisions that capitalism has planted among us. We learn how to overcome, the scars, how to free ourselves from the scars that we all carry in our bodies, in our psyche. You cannot live in a capitalist society without being scarred, without, being afraid of others, so the building of this collective, forms of life, we need to experiment, we need to learn, how do we build new forms of self-government? How do we build new forms of self-management? And I think that today, popular feminist movements are really in the front line in this process. And I mentioned the creation of more collaborative forms of reproduction. I want to add that a crucial part of that is also the creation of what I and many others call commons of knowledge. Commons of knowledge means, forms, the recuperation of collective forms of knowledge, and also the building of collective forms of knowledge. In many parts of Latin America, the Caribbean islands, in Africa, women are now building seed banks banks not to depend on genetically modified products, genetically modified agriculture, to maintain control over the genetic patrimony that we have. This is a role, by the way, the women have performed for centuries. They were the ones, I understand, in traditional society, they really selected the seeds, right? And similarly, there's a lot of communal work done, about recuperating or sharing, knowledge about alternative remedies, so they were not completely dependent on, the big pharma that many times pretend to cure us, but also cause really terrible side effects with those remedies. So the sharing of knowledge, the recuperation and sharing, circulation of knowledge, about our bodies. A very, very important contribution the feminist movement gave in the 1970s in the United States was when a collective of women formed many parts of the country, and they taught women to learn about their bodies. They taught us to learn about our bodies, about menstruation, about menopause, about sexuality, something that nobody had ever taught us, right? And so to be able to regain control over our own life. And not last as a crucial part of building new forms, as well as reconnecting with all the forms of communalism, is the work that now is being done to recuperate, preserve collective memory, and make sure that the memory of the struggle of the past and the memory of the past is present in our life. And our solidarity extends not only to the living, but also to the dead. And the importance, and we are discovering about the importance of that, how essential that, to the continuation of our struggle, because in a way it places what we do into a much broader texture, into a much broader picture. It shows that what we do is part of a longer struggle, for human liberation, and to see ourselves as part of the longer struggle for human liberation also give us the courage not to fear or fear so much for what happens to our individual lives. Because in a way, we know that the dead are not ever completely dead. The dead are present with us. And this is a knowledge, and is also a commitment that we have to make on an everyday basis. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Muito obrigada, Silvia.
Thank you, Silvia.
Foi uma belíssima exposição. Tenho certeza que a gente vai ter aqui algumas questões. A gente ainda tem um tempo, pouquinho, uma meia hora.
It has been a great presentation indeed. I'm sure we're going to have many questions coming to you.
Good. Eu vou então primeiro abrir para o público. Vocês podem fazer pergunta aqui nesse microfone. Quem tiver
So I will
pergunta.
let the audience ask questions. Let's see if they come here forward.
Enquanto isso, eu vou fazendo comentários para aquecer a nossa conversa, a sua bela exposição sobre a importância do movimento feminista na luta anticapitalista. Foi assim é muito importante para nós entendermos que o feminismo não está isolado num contexto mais global de luta contra o capitalismo. Tenho certeza que a gente vai ter aqui uma grande pergunta sobre a sua terceira etapa, mas eu vou deixar primeiro um rapaz que aqui veio fazer uma pergunta.
So this has been a great lecture, Silvia. I will bring about this point that you have mentioned, obviously, that the importance of the feminist movement against capitalism, it means that it has not been isolated at all. I'm sure we will have questions about this and about other aspects of this as well.
Good evening, Silvia Federici. It's a marvelous pleasure to talk to you. And I have a question in an anti-capitalist horizon, whereas if we talk like Maurizio Lazzarato, the immaterial capital or the data capital, all this information, what me and a friend of mine think in the terms of a primitive accumulation of data, what make possible this society of control and so on, what is possible to think about that? The neo-fascism in Brazil, for example, and in the United States are possible because of this data and the circulation and so on and so on. Thank you very much. It's that.
So thank you, Silvia. Have you been able to hear the question? Apologies.
No.
Oh, okay, I will translate it to you. So Silvia, he mentions that looking at the concept of data capital, really, when it comes to how much data is important to that, as the idea of this primitive accumulation of data, it was made possible for the control of people, for the control of humanity. And when you look at the process of neo-fascism in Brazil and the USA, it has been possible because of this data that is available. So the issue of data and control of people. If you could comment on that. And thank you so much for your lecture, he says.
I'm not sure I understand the importance of data and as a means of surveillance, but I would not go so far as to say that the collection of data is what is causing the new forms of fascism. I think that they have much deeper roots, and certainly, coming from the restructuring of the world economy, the neoliberal restructuring of the world economy, which has basically required, stronger forms of repression. Yes, that is required because, as I mentioned before, when we speak about the globalization, we're speaking of a process that has caused massive pauperization, massive, destruction of life, and an organization of basically incredible forms of, division, new hierarchy. That, I think, is where we have to turn our attention. We have to turn our attention to that rather than the collection of data per se. And for instance, we have seen that everywhere social conflicts among people on the local level have increased. And often they have increased also because of the increasing scarcity, like scarcity of land. Scarcity of land has often turned people against each other. I want to mention this because I've done a lot of work myself with other women, for instance, about the return of witch hunting in so many parts of the world. Africa, many parts of Africa, Latin America, really witch hunting almost in a traditional way, you know, with women burned alive, persecuted, expelled from their villages. And we are discovering that at the roots of this new phenomenon, which seemed inconceivable only 50, 60 years ago, at the roots of the phenomenon in many, many cases is the issue of land, that often in several African countries, for women to inherit land or being old and have access to some land is almost a death sentence. And that in a context, placed in a context in which increasingly land, which was the foundation of life, the foundation of reproduction, you know, is now disappearing because of this massive invasion of extractivist companies, right, that are depriving an entire community of what were the traditional. And of course, local conflict and animosities that are created by this scarcity, this created, produced scarcity, right, are also manipulated, you know, by, you know, agents, foreign companies, local chief, government who are interested, who are in fact profiting from allowing these companies to come into their territories. And we have seen also the work of what I call the new missionaries. The new missionaries, like the spread worldwide of Protestant, evangelist, Pentecostal sects, you know, who have, you know, propagated, you know, a very, very virulent brand of Christianity, very virulent, one that, you know, brings back Satan and witches and encourages people to distrust each other, and to blame others for their poverty, to blame others, in a sense, shift the blame for the impoverishment and for the you know, social dislocation, right, on particular individual. And I know that, you know, you are familiar with the work of Protestant sects in Brazil, but it's really happening in many parts of the world. So I believe we have to go beyond the question of the data and to see that the form of surveillance and the instruments by which people are often put against each other, right, are much, much broader, in a sense, even much more dangerous.
Obrigada. Nós temos mais uma pergunta.
Boa noite a todos e todas, e a Silvia Federici. Me pediram para falar pausadamente, né, em português, porque o tradutor está traduzindo aqui simultaneamente. Eu gostaria de parabenizar a Silvia Federici pelo trabalho monumental que ela fez para entender tanto a formação do modo de produção capitalista quanto como se produz e se reproduz. Pensando num livro em que a Silvia Federici fala, né, você fala, né, Silvia Federici, sobre os comuns, o ponto zero da revolução, eu acho que ali fica uma questão em aberto, né, que é uma questão para todos nós, para todas nós. E eu gostaria de saber se você já tem algumas respostas para essa questão que fica em aberto no livro, que é como unir essas experiências, né, dos comuns, que são comuns verdadeiramente anticapitalistas, né, comuns que se recusam a reproduzir a vida com base em opressões. Então, como unir essas experiências? E fica uma outra questão em aberto para mim também, que é como essas experiências não se transformarem em experiências que Marx talvez chamaria de experiências utópicas, né? Como essas experiências elas poderiam de fato, né, ser a ponte de partida para uma tomada de poder e mesmo dos meios de produção e derrubada do capital. Enfim, é isso. Muito, muito obrigada.
I should add some issue that perhaps might evoke some question, because I didn't want to take much time, excessive time in my presentation, but I also would have liked to give many more examples and also speak of the struggle that this is now building very much in Argentina. The struggle, women are making a struggle against debt, indebtment, the economy of debt, because this has been one of the tools that capitalism has used, particularly since the late 70s, when through manipulation of the United States Federal Reserve, which increased the cost of the dollar, increased the price on the dollar, they created artificially the so-called debt crisis. That has become a tool, to in fact enforce more brutal forms of exploitation and to mortgage people's future, to create a new form of financial slavery. A financial slavery that now has extended also to the organization of reproduction. Because despite the fact that more and more women are now working for wages, the employment they gain are so precarious, so underpaid, that necessarily they have to resort to that. And then we have the phenomenon of the microcredit, which is intended to solve women's poverty. But in reality has created a population of women who are completely indebted and often the object of violence when they cannot pay the debt back. And we have also seen the microcredit has been a tool to force women who still, of families, still had some land to sell it off. Because the structure of repayment is such that if you have to repay, you're given only a few weeks. The only way you can do that is to use the money that you have, for commercial purposes. You cannot make money through agriculture in a couple of weeks, because the temporality of agricultural production is much longer. So microcredit has been really a disaster for the majority of women. So there is now recognized that it's women in particular who are the primary victim of debt, as well as students in many countries. In the United States, for instance, going to school, you go to school with tears because you have to pay so much to go to university or tertiary education in general. So now we have seen a feminism that is more and more anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and struggling also in the forefront, not only to defend the land, and by land I mean the natural environment, and to fight against hierarchy, but to also fight against that, and see that that is really a new form of slavery organized by financial means. I wonder if this resonates with the interest of your students.
Sylvia, actually, as we were listening before, there was a question from the audience, and I will translate it to you now.
Sure.
So she said, congratulations on your monumental work. The formation of the capitalist system and its reproduction. I mean, there's a book of yours, and you speak of the commons. One question there for all of us, really, I mean, do you have answers to this question? The question is how to unite these experiences of the commons who are definitely anti-capitalist and who do not want to reduce life to these forms of oppression. And she has one more question: how experience can really become what Marx would have called this idea of the utopic experience, how it would be a bridge to get to that level of change of power and the removal of capital. And she thanks you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, definitely the question of connecting. I think the idea is to see the notion of the commons and the communitarian, as a principle of social organization rather than a set of goods. Like I know, for example, that in Europe, I know in Italy, I'm in Italy now, often you speak of beni comuni, common goods, right? Beni comuni. Well, I understand it, but I'm not totally happy with that definition, because I rather to have another definition, which is commons as a principal organization of society, the communal as a principle by which every activity, cultural, political, economic, is organized. And that's where the ground for continuity exists, so that you don't have a separation between the struggle for common lands, sharing the land, collectively growing, forming association, and the struggle for commons of knowledge, right? And the struggle for commoning the system of justice. Because then you see the commons as something that applies. Commons means the ability to regain the power to make collective decisions over our lives. The power to be able to decide collectively over the decisions that affect most profoundly our life. It means, sharing the natural wealth and the wealth that we produce. And not only sharing, but taking responsibility for its reproduction. Taking responsibility for its production. In other words, as the indigenous nation in the United States have always insisted upon, making sure that the land we use and the goods we use are there, available to the next 7 generations. That we don't just deplete the earth as capitalism is doing. As Marx said, capitalism consumes the earth as it consumes human beings. Right? And, working collectively and decision-making through, I'm very, very encouraged, and it's very interesting, the spread of assemblies in feminist movement today, more and more they're coming together, deciding through assemblies. They brings together, different forms of feminism, different collective, different groups, but at the same time sharing a common ground and making decisions collectively, right? Through, and also the proliferation of neighborhood assemblies, neighbors coming together and deciding on common issues, right? So this to me is how you guarantee that continuity. And that's also the utopic element, right? But we know the utopia should not be looked down upon, because utopia is actually a way of motivating us, right? Of motivating us to action.
Pergunta, por favor, Lucas, se a Silvia aceita mais uma última pergunta. E aí a gente tem mais uma última.
Silvia, would you be able to take one more question?
Sure. Sure.
Sim.
Boa noite a todos e todas. Oi, Silvia, primeiro, muito obrigada. Eu queria dizer que eu tenho estudado o seu trabalho nos últimos 2 anos. E uma questão que me intriga muito, né, em Caliban a Bruxa é sobre a questão da reprodução e por que ela começou. Que durante a peste bubônica a gente teve um problema, né, com a reprodução da força de trabalho e o declínio populacional, né? Então, a minha pergunta, na verdade, é: no início do sistema capitalista, as mulheres foram obrigadas a reproduzir a força de trabalho, então o Estado e a Igreja se voltam para o controle da reprodução. Hoje, que a gente não tem mais esse problema, a minha pergunta é: por que você acha assim, que o Estado ainda foca nessa questão, né, da reprodução? Por que a mulher ainda é obrigada a se manter como um ser que reproduz a força de trabalho se a gente não tem um declínio populacional, se a gente não tem uma peste que dizima parte da população, se a gente não tem nenhum tipo de problema alarmante como foi na Idade Média? É essa a pergunta.
So, Silvia, I'm going to translate her question to you.
Yeah.
So, she thanks you, Silvia, for your lecture. She has been studying your work for the past 2 years, and she mentioned the issue of reproduction, and she would like to listen more on that when it comes to why it started, and when it comes to labor reproduction and the decline of population as a startup concept. In the beginning of capitalism, women had to go to work, and there was that moment of church and state got split. But today that's not the case anymore. So why does the state then still want to enforce this if we are not in the same scenario, in the same place? We do not have the same, let's say, difficulties of the medieval times when you make that comparison. Thank you.
I'm not so sure I understand what...
Probably because I didn't translate very well. It was hard to listen, actually. I maybe will ask for one more time.
Luca, eu vou repetir a pergunta dela, porque eu acho que talvez ela tenha dificuldade.
Absolutely.
Ela está falando, na época medieval, um pouco antes da caça às bruxas, você teve um declínio muito grande populacional e, enfim, há uma demanda por um controle maior da população e a capacidade reprodutiva da mulher é um foco do Estado.
What is specifically the change?
I'm listening to the translation again, Silvia. I apologize for my delay.
A gente hoje não tem mais uma necessidade de controle, no sentido, não tem mais um declínio populacional, a necessidade de você fomentar a reprodução. Por que então o Estado ainda se interessa pelo controle da reprodução social?
Okay. So let's try. I'm gonna try one more time. So when it comes to medieval times, before witch hunt, there was this idea of decline of population, so the demand for population control and reproduction. But we today do not have the need to control population anymore because there's not that decline anymore. So why is that the state is still so interested in social reproduction? I hope that's better now.
The state is interested in socially, actually, by the way, again, with more time, I would have liked to also make a little history of the term, because I discovered over time that words have histories, right? Words have histories, and sometimes reconstructing the history of a term. So, for example, reproduction begins in the 18th century, in the natural sciences, to indicate the cycle by which organisms, reproduce themselves. And then it begins to migrate, actually with the physiocraft. Philosophy student may have studied the physiocraft, but begins to migrate into the social sciences. And that's how Marx begins to use the concept of reproduction, social reproduction, to indicate both the way capitalism reproduces itself, and for example, the crisis it goes through, and also it talks about the fact the reproduction of labor power. The labor power needs to be reproduced, right? And then there's the feminists who extend that concept and connect it to. So there's a very interesting. Now, today, capitalism is vitally interested in social reproduction, because reproduction is not just procreation. Reproduction is very broad. It covers a very broad set of activities, right? Activities ranging from not only the cooking and cleaning, sexual work. I see sexual work as part of reproduction. Yeah, it's all the work that takes place in a home, which is emotional work, sexual work, the work of keeping the family together, right? And over time, with the development of ecofeminism, with the influence of ecological struggle on the feminist movement, the notion of reproduction is also expanded in feminist theory and feminist practice. We began to see, subsistence agriculture is part of reproduction, right? Healing, all the work of healing, nursing, healing. So it's a very, very broad sphere of activity. And I was saying before, even preserving the memory. So capitalism is vitally interested in social reproduction, because in a way, it's all the work, it's all the vast universe of activity that enables, right? Enables a workforce that produces constantly a workforce, right? And as well, and increasingly, is immediately a point of accumulation. Immediately a point of accumulation, right? And this is, for instance, I mentioned before that most women now not only do reproductive work, but have a job, earn very low wages, and now go to shop with a credit card. You're shopping with, and so they're making money, the capitalist class is making money by all these financial means that we are forced to use, not just because they make our life simpler, as we are told, but because very often we don't have the money. And so we keep using credit card, so many women. And so there's been a financialization of reproductive work. So reproductive work, many aspects of reproductive work are now immediate places for capitalist accumulation. The classical example, going to the market, shopping for the week, and paying with a credit card. So that's why in capitalism, social reproduction, it's really the foundation upon which every labor activity relies. It's really the ground on which every form of work and work exploitation relies.
Obrigada. Acho que a gente pode então encerrar. Agradecer muitíssimo a sua belíssima conferência. A gente agradece o seu tempo.
Thank you, so Silvia. And this is how we want to end. We appreciate you so much. And here is the audience.
Thank you. Very good. I wish I could see even better, but I'm very glad that I was able to spend this time with you tonight. And I hope that this has been a bit useful. And thank you, Susanna, and thank you, Luis, for this meeting.
Boa noite.
Bye.
Anpof Anpof é uma associação que reúne 54 programas de pós-graduação em filosofia no Brasil, reconhecidos pela CAPES. Destes programas, 54 oferecem cursos de mestrado, sendo um mestrado profissional e um mestrado profissional em rede. 31 programas oferecem cursos de doutorado. Somos 14 programas na região Sul, 22 na região Sudeste, 4 no Centro-Oeste, 12 no Nordeste e 2 no Norte. A Anpof reúne 72 grupos de trabalho, que contemplam e expressam a diversidade dos campos de trabalho e estudo de nossa área. Desde 1984, promovemos bianualmente encontros nacionais para reunir os nossos GTs e toda a nossa comunidade filosófica. Trabalhamos para defender os interesses dos nossos programas e para defender a filosofia em seus diversos âmbitos de pesquisa e docência, do ensino médio ao ensino universitário. Nossa atuação é orientada para a promoção de um ambiente de debate sobre temas da sociedade e do mundo desde uma perspectiva filosófica. A Anpof acredita na liberdade de expressão, no pensamento crítico, em uma sociedade livre e soberana, na coletividade, na comunidade, na justiça social e em uma sociedade plural e livre de preconceitos. Anpof, Associação Nacional de